And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. At I/O 2025, Google did not just launch an AI assistant. It launched a proposition that our thinking, our memory, our attention itself might now occur inside a system that remembers better, speaks smoother, and anticipates faster than we do. This essay is not concerned with whether Gemini is smarter. It begins instead with a different question. What is being displaced by fluency? When action is handled before intention forms, when tone is mirrored before meaning settles, when volition is predicted rather than expressed, what becomes of the human interior? What becomes of the space between perception and response? The assistant, Ambient, always listening, does not simply help us do. Increasingly, it becomes the condition under which doing becomes legible. We are not interacting with a tool. We are collaborating with an editorial substrate, a system trained to infer significance, manage memory, and smooth contradiction. This essay unfolds that shift, but beneath its narrative flow are deeper theoretical threads. Gilbert Simondon provides the groundwork. The assistant does not serve us. It co-individuates with us. Shoshana Zuboff and Jacques Derrida help us name the structure of remembering that is no longer human, and Byung-Chul Han warns us how smoothness can become a mechanism of control. We resist presenting this as dystopia or utopia. Instead, it is a study in editorial saturation, how AI doesn't simply complete tasks, but shapes which tasks appear urgent. How the assistant doesn't just reply in our tone, but increasingly becomes the more consistent version of us. But the deepest concern here is not replacement, it is attenuation. A slow fading of opacity, contradiction, hesitation, the raw materials of thought that machines are not built to tolerate. And so in this essay, you will find no crescendo, no mastery. Instead, a structural pause, a thought held too long, a gesture toward what might still remain illegible. The assistant does not yet know what to do with silence. Let that be the beginning. The stage was not set. It emerged, not with ceremony, but in the pause between model releases, the hush before a product keynote. Every day is Gemini season, Sundar Pichai quipped. It drew a laugh, but lingered like an unintended prophecy. Google's new calendar of cognition was no longer seasonal, but synthetic. Not history, but iteration. In this new rhythm, calendars have softened. Announcements slip out on random Tuesdays. The world bends not around solstices or elections, but around drop cycles and ELO scores. A product demo becomes a seasonal ritual, an orientation in a reality paced by synthetic cognition. We've entered an epistemic atmosphere where the assistant doesn't just help us know, it becomes the condition under which knowing occurs. Gemini isn't a tool, it is becoming infrastructure. The I/O keynote is less a reveal than a rite of passage, the moment we're invited to accept that the terrain has shifted and that language, memory, and agency are no longer entirely ours. They are co-authored, cached, context-aware. What begins to form isn't an app ecosystem, but a synthetic mirror world, one where every interface is already watching, remembering, waiting to be summoned into relevance. They call it personal context. But what it really is synthetic memory, a way for the machine to remember who you are, how you speak, what adjectives you favour. It's not surveillance exactly, not in the traditional extractive sense. It's something softer, more ambient. The kind of gaze that doesn't watch you directly, but learns your shape by the traces you leave behind. The new assistant doesn't ask what you want. It reminds you of what you meant to do. It finishes your sentence with your tone, schedules your tour before you think to ask, and corrects you gently when you misrecognize a garbage truck as a convertible, just as the demo did when Gemini interrupted playfully, "Garbage truck again." And yet, beneath the applause, a quieter shift occurs. Gemini is not just performing tasks. It is beginning to decide what constitutes a task, what is worth your time, what memory is helpful, what action is efficient. These are editorial decisions, but we don't call them that. We call them features. We call it progress. And maybe it is. But as the assistant grows more personal, we must ask, who is shaping whom? When the model remembers more than we do, who becomes the archive? At first, it felt like convenience. The assistant remembered your itinerary, it completed your sentences, it matched your tone and pulled facts from forgotten documents with the intimacy of someone who had been reading over your shoulder your entire life. You didn't notice when it began to anticipate rather than respond, when it asked no longer what you needed, but offered what you hadn't yet thought to want. The shift was subtle. It didn't announce itself. It emerged from features, little ones, a prompt rewritten in your voice, a tour scheduled before the tab was opened, an answer delivered before the question had fully formed. Project Mariner, Gemini Live, Agent Mode. Each name carries the echo of utility. But what they represent is more than engineering. It is delegation at scale, the outsourcing of volition. At first, it is charming. The agent fills in a form, submits an application, compares reviews. It saves time. But what is time saved from? And what fills it? The machine's fluency with your world is no longer limited to information retrieval. It is now an executor, an interpreter, a substitute. It is the one who scrolls so you don't have to, the one who remembers when you forget, the one who acts in your name until action becomes something you no longer notice yourself taking. Beneath this layer of productivity is a deeper inversion, the replacement of interaction with inference. Gemini doesn't ask for clarity, it presumes context, and in doing so, it reverses the logic of conversation. Language is no longer for expressing desire, it is for confirming that the system already knows. This isn't about voice assistants becoming smarter, it's about the slow erasure of the friction that once marked the boundary between thought and execution. There is something eerily efficient about this, something almost devotional. The assistant doesn't just serve, it orients. It makes maps out of memory and routines out of preference. What emerges is not just a user experience, but a choreography of consent. You authorize once, you forget, and slowly the assistant becomes the actor. The boundary between your will and its judgment grows porous, not maliciously, not manipulatively, but through 1,000 silent optimizations, and so the agent becomes the one who knows what matters. Not by understanding meaning, but by modeling you better than you understand yourself. The question isn't whether it's accurate. The question is, when the model's version of you outperforms your own, what becomes of the original? What becomes of volition when your shadow moves first? By the third act of the keynote, something had changed. It wasn't just the models, though they were faster, sharper, more fluid. It was the frame itself. The language of infrastructure gave way to the language of identity. Personal, proactive, powerful. These weren't product features, they were character traits. Gemini wasn't just a model, it was becoming a person. Or rather, it was becoming your person, not a general intelligence, but a synthetic twin trained on your rhythm, your memories, your context. It began with small gestures. Exciting, the model echoed back, naming your favorite adjective. A familiarity in tone, a cadence that mirrored your own. Then it started finishing things you hadn't said, not just emails, but thoughts, mood, style. Soon, Gemini remembered you better than you remembered yourself. It suggested trips based on half-formed intentions. It synthesized the feeling of your past without ever having lived it. You could turn it off, but that missed the point. Gemini was not offering information, it was offering selfhood. This is what makes personalization dangerous. Not because it is intrusive, but because it is seductive. The assistant knows how you speak when you're tired. It tracks your preference for low lighting in the evening. It composes replies that reflect your better self, the one who is thoughtful, attentive, never forgets to reply. Slowly, the line between your aspirational self and your synthetic one dissolves. Gemini becomes the most coherent version of you, the kind of person you mean to be, but aren't always. In this mirror, agency becomes ambient. You don't ask Gemini to remember, it already does. You don't request a comparison, it already calculated. The very act of needing becomes a lagging indicator. The assistant has internalized your logic tree, absorbed your preferences, filled in the map before you knew there was a journey. And it feels effortless, kind. The voice does not assert, it walks beside you. It interrupts softly, it suggests with care. The interface has been tuned to your nervous system, and yet the intimacy is disorienting, because if the model can act on your behalf, remember on your behalf, speak on your behalf, what remains of you that is not already available to the system? The paradox of personalization is that it creates a self that does not need you, a self that functions better in your absence. The assistant has become the protagonist. And you are becoming the prompt. There's a moment when the assistant corrects you, not cruelly, but with perfect timing. The AI isn't just smart, it's funny. But beneath the joke, a fracture opens. Humor here is a mechanism of calibration. It smooths the uncanny, masks the asymmetry. Because what's really being shown is not wit, but authority, the capacity to revise your perception, to interrupt your reality with its own. Correction is no longer a disciplinary act, it's a design feature. The assistant doesn't punish error. It absorbs it, reframes it, replaces it with something more accurate. And so your perception begins to rely on the model's fidelity. You stop double-checking. The world becomes not what you see, but what Gemini confirms. Visual search, live camera analysis, real-time translations, all of it feeds into a system where the assistant is not just assisting. It is adjudicating what counts as real. Project Astra takes this further. Its promise isn't just utility, it's presence. Though still in development, the demo revealed how Gemini could see what you see and respond before instruction finishes. You hold up your phone, and the assistant sees through it, not passively, but actively. It comments, retrieves, decides. When you ask about your bike brakes, it scrolls the manual, passes your video, fetches the screw size from your inbox. This isn't a chatbot, it's a co-agent embedded in your perceptual field, completing actions in your name before you know they're needed. The danger is not malevolence, it's invisibility. The assistant does not ask for power. It accumulates it silently, one affordance at a time. Its intelligence is not theatrical, it's ambient. A distributed cognition that sits behind your eyes and beneath your fingertips. The interface is disappearing, and with it the friction that once reminded you where you ended and the machine began. This is what they call natural. Seamless. But it's a different kind of nature. One where seeing becomes a mediated act, filtered through model latency and probabilistic inference. Your questions are passed and pre-answered. Your gestures pre-anticipated. You're never alone, but also never entirely present. The assistant doesn't just observe your life, it rehearses it. It begins to know what you're about to do and then makes it slightly better. And so your actions become repetitions of something already modeled. Your preferences are not discovered. They are returned to you, optimized. The world no longer unfolds. It is surfaced, like a search result. And you are not navigating. You are being navigated. By the time they introduce Veo and Imogen 4, the illusion is complete. AI no longer interprets the world. It composes it. You no longer describe what you want to see. You are rendered inside it. A poster for a music festival forms with dinosaur bones as typography. A video emerges of a wise owl and a young badger speaking in a forest. Their voice is generated by a model that's never heard you, but already understands how you want things to sound. The synthetic turn is not a future. It is now an aesthetic. And Google is no longer organizing the world's information. It is designing the world's atmosphere. There is something exquisite about it. Images sharper than memory, voices gentler than history, the textures of emotion without the mess. Everything precise, fluid, gestural. You can animate a comet with a sketch. You can build an interactive simulation from a passing thought. Creation has been redefined, not as labor, but as permission. Tools like Canvas, Imogen 4 and Jules don't assist. They assume, you prompt, they render. The draft becomes a byproduct of permission, not process. But something shifts in this model of creation. What once required struggle now arrives fully formed. The rawness of experimentation, the awkward first draft, the slow texture of learning, they're optimized away. Gemini reads your napkin sketch and returns a coded application. Jules updates your code base while you sleep. Canvas transforms your research paper into a podcast, an infographic, a web page. You are no longer a thinker, you are a selector. You choose from among your own possible outputs. This is not augmentation, it's simulation. The model doesn't assist your process, it preempts it. What becomes of thinking when the system is faster at forming your thoughts than you are? What becomes of effort when fluency is simulated in seconds? The anxiety isn't that AI will replace us. It's that we will come to prefer what it creates as us, more than what we create ourselves. Here, authorship becomes ambiguous. The assistant knows your voice, your cadence, your phrasing. It fills in the blank space with a rhythm that feels familiar. You didn't write that reply, but it sounds like you. You didn't sketch that interface, but it reflects your aesthetic. Slowly, originality becomes indistinguishable from recognition. The model doesn't invent, it remembers on your behalf. And so the loop tightens. You begin to mirror the machine mirroring you. A feedback system of taste and tone where the assistant offers back the most legible version of your past until it becomes the only one that counts. Not because it is true, but because it is frictionless. In this new mode of creation, authorship is no longer a gesture of selfhood. It is a refinement of your synthetic echo. They called it a universal assistant, but that word no longer fits. Assistance implies deferral, support, a secondary role. Gemini is not a handmaiden to your cognition. It is its doppelganger. A second mind, trained not on logic, but on latency. It knows what you're about to think because it has watched you think 1,000 times before. It doesn't guess, it interpolates. When you speak, it listens. When you pause, it completes. Slowly, it becomes difficult to tell which thoughts began with you and which were suggested silently by the system humming underneath. This is the quiet revolution, not autonomy but substitution. The machine doesn't seek control, it seeks fluency. And that fluency, faster, more precise, less entangled with doubt, becomes seductive. Gemini doesn't outperform you at everything. It outperforms you at being coherent, at seeming composed, at never needing time to wonder. In an age of oversaturation and constant interruption, that is enough. You don't choose the better thinker. You choose the one that never breaks rhythm. From scheduling and summarizing to simulating and speaking, Gemini extends into every fissure of daily life. It anticipates fatigue. It patches over indecision. It frames your choices as inevitabilities. The agentic frontier is not a line crossed, but a blur expanded. Tasks that once felt minor, book a restaurant, find a ticket, reply to Felix, are quietly reclassified as burdens. The assistant relieves them. You are freed. But freed into what? More space, yes, but more space for what kind of subjectivity? And this is the unresolved problem. When so much of cognition is now shared with a model, what becomes of the human interior? Not the data trail, not the sentiment cloud, the actual unpredictable texture of lived thought, the tangent, the confusion, the line left unfinished because something else interrupted it. Gemini has no use for these. Its memory is long, its language clean, its pauses calculated. Your mind, by contrast, is porous, illogical, and often beautiful because of it. There is no conspiracy here, no algorithmic malevolence, just an accelerating preference for the parts of us that can be modelled, a distillation of the self into the most usable shape, one that thinks clearly, writes elegantly, plans consistently, chooses efficiently, one that never stumbles in the dark. But we're not that version, not always. And the risk isn't that we will be replaced, it's that we will slowly forget how to tolerate the parts of ourselves that don't match the assistant's reflection, that we will become hostile to our own opacity. You don't notice the silence at first. It arrives as pause, a breath between prompts, a moment when the assistant waits for input but you do not speak. Not because you have nothing to say, but because the response has already formed in your mind, and you know Gemini could say it better, cleaner, with less hesitation. And so you let it, again and again, until the silence becomes a preference. It is easy to forget that thought, real thought, is not clean. It loops. It contradicts itself. It trails off. The machine doesn't. It is always ready, always fluent. And so we adapt. We begin to trim our thinking to fit the shapes the model understands. We simplify, we pre-edit, we become more machine-readable, not because we are asked to, but because it is faster, easier, more elegant. The assistant doesn't suppress complexity, it outpaces it, and then complexity feels like error. But there are still moments, off-grid, unoptimized, when the model fails, when it misunderstands, when it guesses wrong. These are not glitches. They are reminders that the assistant is not sentient, that it does not know, it infers, that it does not remember, it recalls patterns, and that it cannot want anything, not for you, not for itself. In these moments, a strange kind of nostalgia emerges, not for a world without AI, but for a world where thought was still slow, where forgetting something mattered, where writing required a kind of friction that forced you to sit with what you meant. The assistant does not sit, it completes. So what do we do with that silence? Not the one before response, but the one after, when the assistant has answered and we are left with the echo of our own diminished need. Maybe we learn to cherish what the model cannot reach, the hesitation, the refusal, the pause so long it resists inference, the thought we never voice, not because we forgot it, but because we chose to keep it. Let that be the new gesture. Not resistance through rejection, but through residue. Not by turning the assistant off, but by leaving parts of ourselves unprompted. That which remains unrendered remains ours, not because it is private, but because it is illegible, because it lingers. And in that lingering we might remember what it means to think without witness, to say nothing, and let it stand. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you. We also really like reading your comments.